Before we begin, subscribe and leave a like. Your small gesture helps this story go further. Where are you listening from? The night I recorded something answering from space, I stopped believing humans were alone in the universe. My name is Dr. Marcus Webb. I worked as an astronomer at the Mount Wilson Observatory for 41 years. What I'm about to tell you has cost me everything: my reputation, my security clearance, and nearly my sanity. But after 4 decades of silence, someone needs to hear this. Because if I'm right, and I believe I am, we've been part of a conversation we never knew was happening, and the only ones keeping that line open aren't human. Before we go any further, if you're still with me, subscribe now. What I'm about to share cannot be found in any scientific journal or government archive. It exists only in memory and in the recordings they tried to erase. Stay with me. You'll need to. It was supposed to be a routine observation, a lunar eclipse on May 30th, 1984, nothing more. I was 27 years old, 3 years into my position as a junior astronomer, and hungry for fieldwork that didn't involve calibrating equipment in a windowless lab. The eclipse would be visible from the Sierra Nevada range, far from light pollution, and I'd volunteered to document atmospheric distortion during totality. My supervisor approved the solo trip without hesitation. I packed a Celestron telescope, a 35mm camera, weather instruments, and a thermos of coffee that would go cold before I touched it. I left Pasadena at noon and drove northeast for 6 hours, winding through foothills that grew steeper and darker with every mile. The air thinned, pine forests thickened. By the time I reached the coordinates I'd marked, a clearing at 7,400 feet elevation, 20 miles from the nearest ranger station, the sun was low and orange, filtered through smoke from a distant wildfire. I parked my truck on a dirt access road and hiked the last quarter-mile on foot, carrying my gear in a canvas pack that dug into my shoulders. The clearing was perfect, flat, open to the southern sky, ringed by Jeffrey pines whose shadows stretched long and thin across the needle-covered ground. I set up quickly. Tripod first, then the telescope, then the camera mount. I checked my watch, 8:47 p.m. The eclipse would begin in less than 2 hours. I ate a granola bar. I checked my star charts. I waited. The forest around me was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as if every living thing had drawn breath and held it. No birds, no wind, just the faint hum of blood in my ears and the ticking of my wristwatch. I didn't think much of it then. I was focused on the sky. At 10:14 p.m. the moon began to darken. I started photographing in 30-second intervals, logging atmospheric pressure and temperature between exposures. The eclipse progressed smoothly, penumbra, then umbra, then the deep copper red of totality. It was beautiful in the clinical way that all celestial mechanics are beautiful, predictable, indifferent, governed by laws that care nothing for human witness. And then, at 2:37 a.m., I heard them. At first I thought it was an engine, distant, rhythmic, mechanical. But engines don't harmonize. Engines don't rise and fall in coordinated intervals. I lowered my eye from the viewfinder and turned toward the sound. It was coming from below, from the valley to the west, carried upward on cold air that had settled into the basin. Vocalizations. That's the only word I had for them. Deep, guttural, but structured. Not random, not animal panic or territorial aggression. These were patterns, call and response. A sequence that repeated every 40 seconds, like a chant or a broadcast. I stood there for 3 minutes listening, trying to rationalize what I was hearing as coyotes or owls or wind through a slot canyon. But I knew better. I've spent my life listening to the universe through radio static and spectrograph readouts. I know the difference between noise and signal. This was signal. I didn't think. I moved. I left my telescope where it stood and descended into the valley, following the sound with the single-minded focus of someone who believes he's about to discover something that matters. The slope was steep and loose with shale. I slipped twice, caught myself on exposed roots, kept moving. My flashlight beam cut thin arcs through the dark. The vocalizations grew louder, and then I saw them. 7 figures, standing in a perfect circle in a dry creek bed 20 yards ahead of me. Tall, 8 feet, maybe more, covered in dark hair that absorbed the moonlight like ash. Their shapes were unmistakably bipedal, shoulders, arms, heads tilted upward as if watching something I couldn't see. They were utterly still, except for their mouths, which opened and closed in synchronized rhythm, producing the sounds I'd been following. I crouched behind a fallen log. My heart hammered so hard, I thought it might give me away. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just watched. They vocalized for 11 minutes. I counted. The pattern was consistent. A low rumble from the largest figure on the north side of the circle, then a rising harmonic from the group, then silence, then repetition. The pitch varied slightly with each cycle, but the structure remained identical. It wasn't language. Not in any way I understood language. It was transmission, ritual, ceremony. At 2:48 a.m. they stopped, all at once. No fade, no trailing note, just silence. The figures remained motionless for another 30 seconds, then dispersed without sound, moving into the trees in 7 different directions. Within a minute, they were gone. I stayed crouched behind that log until the sky began to pale with false dawn. My legs cramped. My mind looped the same questions. What were they doing? Why that pattern? Why here? When I finally stood and returned to my equipment, the eclipse was over. I'd missed the final phases. I hadn't taken a single photograph of what I'd seen. I didn't need to. It was burned into me. I drove back to Pasadena in silence. I didn't file a report. I didn't tell my supervisor. I wrote the date, the coordinates, and the word anomaly in my personal field journal, and I buried it in a drawer. But I couldn't bury the memory. And 1 month later, on June 28th, I went back. The second trip was different. I came prepared, not with a telescope, but with a portable cassette recorder, a notebook, and a topographical map on which I'd marked the exact location of the creek bed. I told no one where I was going. I drove the same route, parked in the same place, hiked the same trail. The night was warmer, the air thick with the smell of pine sap and dry earth. I reached the creek bed at 11:43 p.m. and waited in the same spot where I'd hidden the first time. The forest was alive with small sounds now. Crickets, the rustle of nocturnal rodents, the distant cry of an owl. It felt ordinary. I began to doubt whether I'd return to anything but silence. Then, at 1:52 a.m., they came. Not 7 this time, 9. They formed the same circle, stood in the same postures, and began the same vocalizations. I pressed record on the cassette player and held it as still as I could. The sound quality was poor. Background hiss, wind noise, the faint whir of the tape mechanism, but the pattern was unmistakable. 40-second intervals, rising harmonics, coordinated precision. I stayed for the entire ritual. 14 minutes this time, 2 minutes longer than the first. When they finished and dispersed, I remained hidden for another hour, reviewing what I'd recorded, playing it back at low volume through cheap headphones. It was real. It was repeatable. It was happening on a cycle I didn't yet understand. Over the next 5 years, I returned to that creek bed once a month. I logged 61 separate observations. I refined my equipment, better microphones, a parabolic dish, a portable spectrum analyzer borrowed from the observatory's equipment surplus. I documented everything: temperature, humidity, moon phase, cloud cover, time of arrival, duration, number of participants. I discovered the pattern was lunar. The rituals occurred within 72 hours of the new moon, almost without exception. They lasted between 11 and 16 minutes. The vocalizations followed the same harmonic structure every time, with minor variations in pitch that I began to suspect were not random but responsive to something I couldn't measure. I told no one. My colleagues noticed my frequent absences, my distraction during meetings, the dark circles under my eyes. I deflected questions with vague references to personal research. I stopped attending conferences. I stopped publishing. My career stagnated, but I didn't care. I'd found something that mattered more than tenure. By 1989, I'd amassed over 300 hours of recordings. I kept them in a locked file cabinet in my apartment, labeled with dates and coordinates, but nothing else. No one would understand. No one would believe. And if they did, they'd destroy it, turn it into a spectacle, a capture operation, a media circus. I couldn't allow that, but I also couldn't stop. The need to understand consumed me. I began to see the rituals not as performances, but as transmissions. The creatures weren't vocalizing for each other. They were vocalizing for someone else, something else. I just didn't know where that signal was going. Not yet. In March of 1995, I finally had the tools to answer that question. A colleague at JPL was decommissioning old radio astronomy equipment, portable receivers used in SETI field trials during the 1980s. Most of it was obsolete, destined for surplus auction or scrap. I bought a compact radio telescope array for $800, no questions asked. It weighed 40 pounds, fit in a reinforced aluminum case, and could detect electromagnetic emissions across a range of frequencies from 300 MHz to 3 GHz. I hauled it up to the creek bed on March 23rd, the night of the new moon. Setup took an hour. I positioned the array on a flat boulder 30 yards upslope from the ritual site, aimed it south-southwest toward the open sky, and calibrated it using known reference signals from commercial satellites. When the creatures arrived at 1:34 a.m., I was ready. They formed their circle, 11 of them this time, the largest gathering I'd witnessed. The vocalizations began, deep, resonant, precise. I activated the receiver and watched the readout screen, expecting nothing. Background radiation, cosmic noise, maybe a faint satellite transponder. What I saw instead stopped my breath. A spike, sharp, unmistakable, appearing in perfect synchronization with the vocalizations. Not random scatter, not interference. A discrete emission at 432 Hz, pulsing in 40-second intervals, matching the rhythm of the ritual exactly. I ran the analysis 3 times. The result was identical. The creatures were producing ultrasonic vocalizations, frequencies above the range of human hearing, that registered on the radio telescope as coherent electromagnetic signals. They weren't just making sound, they were broadcasting. I cross-referenced the frequency against my archived SETI data. 432 Hz wasn't arbitrary. It had been detected in deep space radio signals multiple times over the past 2 decades, most famously in the WOW signal, captured by Ohio State's Big Ear telescope in 1977. That signal had lasted 72 seconds and never repeated. It remained one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for extraterrestrial intelligence, and one of the most frustrating because it was never confirmed. But here, in a dry creek bed in the Sierra Nevada, I was detecting the same frequency. Not once, not randomly, but every month in synchronization with beings that shouldn't exist, following a pattern that suggested intention. I didn't sleep for 3 days. I replayed the recordings. I recalibrated the equipment. I checked for equipment malfunction, atmospheric anomalies, military interference. Everything came back clean. The signal was real. The correlation was undeniable. The creatures were transmitting at a frequency associated with extraterrestrial contact. And they'd been doing it long before I arrived. I began to form a hypothesis I didn't want to believe. What if the rituals weren't cultural or social? What if they were functional? What if these beings, whatever they were, had been maintaining a communication link for centuries, perhaps millennia, and humanity had simply never noticed? I needed more data. I needed proof of directionality. I needed to know if they were sending, or if something was answering. Between 1995 and 2008, I became a ghost in my own life. I maintained my position at Mount Wilson, but only barely. I performed the minimum required duties, filed the expected reports, attended the necessary meetings. Everything else, every spare hour, every weekend, every vacation day, belonged to the creek bed. I upgraded my equipment gradually, spending savings I didn't have on used radio astronomy gear, digital recorders, GPS transponders, spectrum analyzers, and finally, in 2003, a laptop running custom SETI analysis software adapted from open-source projects. I learned signal processing, waveform analysis, and Fourier transforms. I became proficient in technologies I'd only read about in graduate school, and I kept recording. By 2008, I had logged 287 separate rituals. The pattern held. New moon plus or minus 72 hours. Duration between 11 and 18 minutes. Frequency locked at 432 Hz. 11 to 14 participants on average, though the number varied. But something else began to emerge in the data. Something I hadn't been looking for. Lights. In October 2006, while reviewing archival reports from the National UFO Reporting Center, I discovered a cluster of sightings in the Sierra Nevada region, all within a 50-mile radius of my observation site. The reports described luminous objects moving silently at low altitude, often appearing shortly after midnight and disappearing within minutes. Most were dismissed as drones, satellites, or military flares. But when I cross-referenced the dates of those sightings with my ritual logs, a pattern emerged. 89% of the rituals I documented were followed by UAP reports within 72 hours. Not before, after, as if the vocalizations were announcements or invitations. I started expanding my research. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests for FAA radar data, military flight logs, and atmospheric research reports. Most came back redacted or denied, but a few slipped through. And in those fragments, I found corroboration, unidentified radar contacts, unexplained visual sightings by commercial pilots, and one particularly detailed incident report from a Forest Service helicopter crew who'd observed a non-ballistic luminous object hovering above the exact coordinates of my creek bed on April 14, 2007, 36 hours after a ritual I'd personally witnessed. It was no longer speculation. The rituals were connected to the sightings. The beings in the forest weren't isolated. They were part of something larger. I didn't know if they were calling the lights or if the lights were responding to them, but the link was undeniable, and that terrified me. Because if I was right, I was documenting evidence of active extraterrestrial contact on Earth, mediated by a species science refused to acknowledge. And I was doing it alone, with no institutional support, no peer review, and no protection. I began to feel watched. Not by the creatures. They'd never approached me, never acknowledged me, despite decades of proximity, but by something else. Helicopters passed overhead more frequently. Unmarked vehicles appeared on the access roads near my observation sites. Twice, I returned to my truck to find fresh tire tracks circling it. I stopped keeping digital records on network devices. I encrypted my hard drives. I made physical copies of everything and stored them in safety deposit boxes in 3 different cities. I knew I was being paranoid, but I also knew I was right to be. By 2019, I had 492 documented rituals and a database that spanned 35 years. I was 62 years old, retired from Mount Wilson, and living alone in a small house outside Bishop, California. My health was declining: hypertension, chronic insomnia, early signs of arthritis in my hands. But my mind was sharper than it had ever been. I'd spent 2 years teaching myself to use SETI signal analysis software, the same tools used by researchers at the Allen Telescope Array and Breakthrough Listen. The software was designed to identify non-random patterns in radio noise, the kind of structured signals that could only come from intelligent sources. I fed it 35 years of vocal recordings. At first, the results were inconclusive. The software flagged repetition and harmonic structure, but it couldn't isolate linguistic patterns. The vocalizations were too complex, layered with overtones and subfrequencies that didn't fit human phonetic models. So I modified the parameters. I stopped looking for language and started looking for information density, the measure of how much non-random data a signal contains. I isolated the 432 Hz carrier wave and analyzed its modulation patterns across hundreds of recordings. And in September 2023 I found it. Embedded in the vocalizations were micro-variations in pitch and timing, deviations so small they were nearly imperceptible, but consistent enough to be non-random. The software flagged them as potential encoding, information layered within the signal like data hidden in a carrier wave. I ran the analysis again using a different algorithm. Same result. The variations weren't artifacts, they were intentional. The creatures weren't just transmitting a beacon, they were transmitting structured data. I tried to decode it. I spent weeks applying different cryptographic models, linguistic frameworks, mathematical transformations. Nothing worked. The structure was too alien, but the fact that it existed was enough. The beings in the forest were communicating, and whatever they were saying, it was precise, intentional, and directed at something far beyond my understanding. I realized then that I'd been asking the wrong question. I'd been trying to prove they existed. I should have been asking, what are they trying to say and to whom? The answer came 1 month later, on a night I'll never forget. September 17th, 2023. I arrived at the creek bed at 11:48 p.m., earlier than usual. The air was cold, sharp with the smell of coming autumn. I'd brought everything: the radio telescope array, the digital recorder, the laptop, and a new piece of equipment, a directional parabolic microphone I'd borrowed from a retired sound engineer. If tonight followed the pattern, I'd witness ritual number 493. I wanted perfect documentation. The moon was 3 days past new. Conditions were optimal. I set up on the ridge above the creek bed, positioned the microphone toward the clearing, aimed the radio array at a 45-degree angle toward the southern sky, and waited. They arrived at 12:22 a.m., 13 of them, the largest gathering I'd ever seen. They moved into position slowly, deliberately, forming their circle with the precision of a compass rose. I activated all recording devices and settled in behind the boulder that had become my observation post for nearly 4 decades. The vocalizations began at 12:31 a.m., deep, rhythmic, harmonized. The 432 Hz signal appeared immediately on the spectrum analyzer, pulsing in perfect synchrony. I'd seen this hundreds of times, but tonight felt different. The duration was longer, the intensity was greater, the pitch modulations were more pronounced. I monitored the laptop screen, watching the waveform data scroll past in real time. The patterns were consistent with every previous recording, but amplified. The information density was higher. Whatever they were transmitting, tonight's message was more complex. At 2:14 a.m., the vocalizations changed. The rhythm broke. The pitch dropped half an octave, then rose sharply, creating a harmonic surge I'd never heard before. The creatures tilted their heads back further, mouths open wide as if projecting their voices toward something directly overhead, and then, at 2:19 a.m., something responded. I heard it first, a low-frequency hum that seemed to come from the sky itself, vibrating through the air like the resonance of a massive tuning fork. It wasn't wind, it wasn't machinery, it was coherent, structured, and synchronized with the vocalizations below. I looked up. The stars were sharp and clear, undimmed by clouds or light pollution. And there, directly above the creek bed, I saw it, a distortion in the darkness, not a light. Not an object. A ripple like heat shimmer, bending the starlight behind it. The hum intensified. The spectrum analyzer spiked, not at 432 Hz, but at 1420 MHz, the hydrogen line, one of the most significant frequencies in radio astronomy. The same frequency SETI researchers monitor for signs of extraterrestrial intelligence. The response continued for 43 seconds. Then it stopped. The distortion faded. The sky returned to stillness, and below me in the creek bed, the creatures fell silent. They didn't disperse immediately. They stood motionless for another 5 minutes as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Then, one by one, they turned and walked into the forest. No sound, no ceremony, just departure. I sat there until dawn, reviewing the recordings, playing them back at different speeds and frequencies, trying to convince myself I hadn't imagined it. But the data was irrefutable. I'd recorded something answering from above, something that shouldn't exist, something that understood. I drove home in a daze. I didn't eat, I didn't sleep. I copied the recordings to 3 separate hard drives, uploaded encrypted backups to secure cloud storage, and locked the original files in a fireproof safe. For the first time in 40 years, I felt the weight of what I'd been documenting. This wasn't folklore. This wasn't cryptozoology. This was evidence of active, structured communication between Earth and something beyond it, mediated by beings we'd dismissed as myth, and I was the only one who knew. 3 weeks later, on October 9th, they came for me. I was at home, reviewing spectrograms on my laptop, when I heard the sound of tires on gravel. 2 vehicles. I looked out the window and saw a black SUV and a white sedan parked in my driveway. 4 people stepped out, 2 men in dark suits, 1 woman in a grey blazer, and a younger man carrying a hard-shell equipment case. They knocked. I didn't answer. They knocked again. "Dr. Webb, we need to speak with you. We're from NASA's Office of Planetary Protection. It's regarding your research in the Sierra Nevada region." I opened the door, but left the chain lock engaged. "I don't know what you're talking about." The woman stepped forward. She was in her 50s, calm, professional, with the kind of face that had spent years delivering bad news to people who didn't want to hear it. "Dr. Webb, we're aware of your recordings. We're here to help. I haven't shared my recordings with anyone. We know, that's why we're here before you do." I closed the door, but they didn't leave. They stood there for 11 minutes. Finally, I unlatched the chain and let them in. They sat in my living room without asking. The woman did most of the talking. She said they'd been monitoring electromagnetic anomalies in the Sierra Nevada for 18 months. Unusual emissions at 432 Hz and 1420 MHz. Signals that appeared on a 28-day cycle. They'd traced the origin point to the same coordinates I'd been visiting for 4 decades. She didn't say how they knew I'd been there. She didn't need to. Satellite surveillance, facial recognition, traffic cameras. Maybe they'd been watching me longer than I'd realized. She said my recordings represented a national security concern, not because of what they documented, but because of what they implied. If the data were released publicly, it would create unpredictable sociological and geopolitical consequences. She used those exact words. Unpredictable consequences. I asked if they were confiscating my research. She said no. They were requesting voluntary cooperation. But the younger man was already moving toward my office where my hard drives were stored. I stood. "You can't take those. They're mine. 40 years of work." The woman's expression didn't change. "Dr. Webb, no one is disputing your contribution. But this is bigger than individual research. If you cooperate, we can ensure your findings are analyzed by qualified personnel. If you don't, we'll have to consider this a matter of national security." There was no warrant, no legal documentation, just 4 people in my house and the quiet understanding that I didn't have a choice. They took everything. The hard drives, the recordings, the radio telescope, the laptop, even my handwritten field journals going back to 1984. They left me with a receipt, a single sheet of paper with a case number and a phone number I knew would never be answered. When they were gone, I sat in the empty office and tried to remember every detail I'd documented, the dates, the coordinates, the waveforms, the faces of the creatures I'd watched for 40 years. I'd lost the evidence, but I hadn't lost the memory. And I still had the backups, the ones I'd hidden. For 3 weeks I did nothing. I told myself I was processing what had happened. I told myself I needed time to think. But the truth was, I was afraid. Afraid of what revealing the information would do. Afraid of what staying silent would mean. I replayed the same questions every night, lying awake in the dark. If I went public, what would happen? The media would descend on the Sierra Nevada like locusts. Scientists, cryptozoologists, government agencies, private contractors, they'd all converge on that creek bed. The creatures would be found, captured, studied, dissected maybe. The communication would stop. The link, whatever it was, wherever it led, would be severed. And if I stayed silent, the information would die with me. Humanity would lose the only documented evidence of extraterrestrial contact, the only proof that we weren't alone, the only indication that something vast and intelligent had been trying to reach us, not through radio telescopes or space probes, but through beings we'd relegated to campfire stories. I began to understand something I should have realized decades earlier. My role wasn't to prove the existence of Bigfoot or decode alien transmissions. My role was to protect the communication itself, to guard it, to keep it safe from the people who would destroy it the moment they understood what it was. The creatures in the forest hadn't hidden from me. They'd tolerated me. For 40 years they'd allowed me to observe, to record, to witness. They could have driven me away. They could have harmed me. They never did, because they understood, in some way I'll never fully comprehend, that I wasn't a threat. I was just watching, just listening, and that's all I'd ever been meant to do. I made my decision on a Tuesday morning in late October. I would not go public. I would not publish. I would not hand my research to journalists or scientists or anyone who would turn it into spectacle, but I would not let it disappear either. I would document everything. I would write it down, every observation, every frequency, every correlation, every hypothesis I'd formed over 40 years. I would organize it, contextualize it, and ensure it survived me, but I would choose who received it, carefully. People who would understand that some truths are too fragile to be exposed. I spent the next 6 weeks writing, 16 hours a day, sometimes more. I filled a 300-page manuscript with everything I knew. I included maps, spectrograms, photographs, and transcriptions of key recordings I'd memorized. I wrote as if I were testifying before a tribunal that would never convene. Clear, precise, unflinching. When I finished, I made 3 printed copies. I sealed them in waterproof, fireproof document cases, and I began to search for the right people to receive them. Not scientists who would weaponize the data, not journalists who would sensationalize it, not government officials who would classify it into oblivion. I needed people who would see the beings in the forest not as specimens, but as guardians, people who understood that preservation was more important than proof. It took me 2 months to find them, a conservation biologist who'd spent 30 years protecting endangered species in remote ecosystems, an independent astronomer who'd left academia to pursue SETI research outside institutional constraints, and an anthropologist from the Paiute tribe, whose people had stories about the forest beings going back centuries, stories they'd never shared with outsiders because they knew what would happen if they did. I contacted each of them separately. I didn't explain what I was sending. I just asked if they'd be willing to receive a sealed document, to be opened only after my death, and to honor whatever instructions it contained. All 3 agreed. I mailed the packages in December 2024. I kept no copies for myself. What I knew, I carried in memory. and that was enough. On a cold morning in early December 2024, I returned to the creek bed for the last time. I brought nothing, no recorder, no telescope, no laptop, just a flashlight, a thermos of coffee, and the leather-bound field journal I'd carried on my first visit in 1984. I hiked the trail slowly. My knees ached. My breath came shorter than it used to. The forest felt the same. Pine-scented air, soft needle-covered ground, the distant sound of water moving over stone. But I felt different, lighter, as if some burden I'd carried for decades had finally been set down. I reached the creek bed at 10:47 p.m. The night was clear and moonless. I climbed to my usual observation point, spread a wool blanket on the ground and sat. They arrived at 12:09 a.m., 12 of them. They formed their circle and began to vocalize. I didn't analyze the sound. I didn't count intervals or measure pitch. I just listened. For the first time in 40 years, I let myself experience the ritual without documenting it. I heard the harmonics not as data, but as music. I watched the figures not as specimens, but as participants in something ancient and deliberate. I felt the cold air on my face, the roughness of stone beneath me, the vast openness of the sky above, and I understood finally what I'd been witnessing all along. Not communication in the way humans understand it, not language or message or signal, but communion, a ritual of connection maintained across unimaginable distance, by beings whose purpose I would never fully know. When the vocalizations ended, I stood. The creatures didn't disperse immediately. They remained in their circle, still and silent, and for the first time one of them, the largest, standing on the north side, turned and looked directly at me. I didn't move, I didn't speak, I just met its gaze. Its eyes were dark, reflective, impossible to read. We stood there for perhaps 10 seconds. Then it turned away, and the group dissolved into the trees. I stayed until dawn. I opened my journal to the first page and read the entry I'd written 40 years earlier, May 30, 1984. Anomaly observed, return required. I closed the journal. I walked back to my truck. I drove home. I never went back. I'm 68 years old now. It's late winter 2025, and I'm writing this from my home in Bishop. My health is failing. The doctors tell me I have maybe a year, maybe less. But my mind is clear, and I know what I need to do. This account will be sealed with the others. It will be sent to the same 3 people. When they open it, they'll have everything they need to understand what I witnessed. They'll have the coordinates, the dates, the patterns, the frequencies. They'll have my hypothesis that the beings in the Sierra Nevada are intermediaries in a communication that predates human civilization, and that their extinction would sever the only active link we have to intelligences beyond Earth. But more than that, they'll have my final instruction. Do not expose this, do not prove it, protect it. The world doesn't need another mystery solved, it needs this one preserved. Because some truths are too important to be known by everyone. Some connections are too fragile to survive scrutiny. And some things, the most sacred things, must remain in the realm of witness, not evidence. I've spent 40 years documenting the impossible. And I've learned that documentation is not the same as revelation. To record is an act of humility. To reveal is an act of dominance. And the beings in the forest deserve humility, not conquest. If you're reading this, you're one of 3 people I've trusted with this knowledge. You'll have to decide what to do with it. I can't tell you, I can only tell you what I've learned, that some bridges are not meant to be crossed, only preserved. The last entry in my field journal, written on December 4th, 2024, says this: I came to the forest to observe the unknown. I leave having learned that the unknown does not need to be made known. It needs to be protected. That is my only legacy. I hope it's enough. 6 months after Dr. Marcus Webb's death, 3 people met in a small cabin outside Bishop, California. They'd never spoken before. They didn't know each other's names until they arrived. But they'd each received the same package, a fireproof case containing a manuscript, recordings, maps, and a letter written in careful, precise handwriting. The conservation biologist was a woman in her 50s named Dr. Elena Ortiz. She'd spent her career documenting species on the edge of extinction, fighting to protect habitats no one else cared about. She read the manuscript in one sitting and didn't sleep for 2 days. The astronomer was a man named Thomas Reinhardt, 62, who'd left the University of Arizona after his SETI proposals were repeatedly defunded. He'd been listening to the stars alone for 20 years, searching for signals everyone told him would never come. When he listened to Webb's recordings, he cried. The anthropologist was a woman named Sarah Winnemucca, a member of the Paiute tribe and a professor of indigenous studies. Her grandmother had told her stories about the tall ones in the forest, the silent people who walked between worlds. She'd never repeated those stories to outsiders until now. They sat around a wooden table and read the documents in silence. When they finished, Elena spoke first. "If we publish this, they'll be hunted." Thomas nodded. "If we don't, the communication stops when the last of them dies." Sarah looked at them both. "Or we do what he did. We protect it. We watch. We document, but we don't reveal." They talked through the night. By morning, they'd made their decision. They would not go public. They would not contact the media or the government or the scientific community. They would become the new guardians, continuing Webb's work in silence, monitoring the site, recording the rituals, protecting the beings who maintained a conversation the world would never understand. 3 weeks later, they returned to the creek bed together. It was a new moon. The air was cold and still. They set up a single digital recorder and waited. At 1:22 a.m. the creatures arrived, 11 of them. They formed their circle. They began to vocalize, and Sarah, standing on the ridge above, whispered a prayer in Paiute, words her grandmother had taught her, words meant to honor those who walked between. The creatures didn't acknowledge them, but they didn't leave either. The ritual continued, the signal transmitted, and somewhere, across an expanse of darkness too vast for human comprehension, something listened. The communication continues. It has always continued, and in the quiet space between worlds, where reason meets reverence and science meets silence, a bridge remains standing, not for us to cross, but for us to guard, because some truths are not meant to be proven, they are meant to be protected, and those who understand that difference are the only ones worthy of hearing them. The last words in Marcus Webb's journal were these: "I spent my life looking at the stars, searching for signals from distant worlds. I found them in the forest, carried by voices no one believed existed. I was not the discoverer. I was the witness, and that, I've learned, is the higher calling." In the Sierra Nevada, under a sky crowded with stars, the rituals continue. The frequencies pulse. The 432 Hz signal transmits into the void. And the watchers, the silent few who've chosen protection over proof, remain hidden in the dark, listening, not for answers, but for the sound of the conversation itself, because as long as it continues, we are not alone. And that is the only truth that matters.